I'm in a strange place wherein I find myself really gravitating toward Queen's News of the World amongst her studio discography. I tend to consider it, along with A Day at the Races and also Queen 2, to be their finest overall work. So, News of the World fascinates me because it's indicative of that late 1970s moment, I imagine certainly in the United States at least, wherein there's this romantic male empowerment thing. You get the image of, one has read about perhaps the situation in, the socio-economic circumstances of a suburban United States, wherein the child of the family has the technology they've been able to have to themselves. There's a television in the living room of the house that the parents use, and they've been able to fit a record player in their room, a turntable, and a massive record collection. There may have been a turntable in the living room, but that was their parents' record collection. They were amassing their own, this generation's voices. And Freddie Mercury succeeded in bringing ballet to the masses, more or less. It's kind of male romance, this sort of, dare I say, chivalric or pseudo-chivalric desire for more in the world of the mundane. A break from business, an escape into partying and rock and roll. I think it is hard to separate an assessment of a Queen album from at least a brief assessment of the group and certain albums around the album in question. For some reason, it seems more intuitive or more justified, somehow, culturally, to discuss and assess an individual Led Zeppelin or Beatles or Who album without having to relate it to what one's opinion of the Who is in general or of the other albums. I think the reason may be that perhaps Queen's individual albums in the 1970s didn't stick out with individual personalities quite in the same way that the albums of Led Zeppelin or the Who's did, for example. I think they were taking this pattern from the Beatles, Led Zeppelin and the Who were, and Queen are probably attempting it as well, to be fair, which each album was this distinct own entity. I think the issue with Queen may have been perhaps that they had such a distinct dynamic sound that it was hard for a Queen album to be its own rather than just a Queen album, because Queen couldn't help but sound totally unique and themselves, and any other genre or style they attempted, it was still fundamentally, inescapably Queen. Led Zeppelin could be inspired by Yes and Emerson, Lake and Palmer for Houses of the Holy. It's a totally unique item in their discography. The Who going about a rock opera on Tommy and on Quadrophenia. Totally distinct from their live sound, for example, and the sound of a quick one, The Who Sell Out, The Who by Numbers, and Who's Next. It's almost a totally different band in intent. One can feel the sound, but it's almost as though it's an entirely different project. And one doesn't tend to see Queen albums listed on greatest album lists, greatest rock album lists of the best Beatles, Zeppelin, Who, Rolling Stones albums, David Bowie albums, and I wonder why that is. Well, in my own personal opinion, I don't tend to think of these Queen albums as being quite as good as the best albums of the aforementioned artists. However, I wonder if my opinion is in line with those who might curate these lists, these hypothetical lists, for example. I suppose a part of it is, I feel there's a need to justify, in particular, a discussion of Queen's News of the World, or any individual Queen album. Why discuss an individual Queen album? Why start in the middle of the discography? If I just went out and discussed Led Zeppelin's Presence, people might understand, okay, yeah, that's a unique item in their discography, it's a unique album. If we went and just discussed randomly Revolver in the middle of the Beatles' discography, fair enough. Rumours for Fleetwood Mac right in the middle of the discography. Yeah, if I just went straight to Adam Heart Mother by Pink Floyd, it's all Pink Floyd albums are very distinct and different from each other. Why News of the World? Why not Night at the Opera? Why not Queen 2? Why not Sheer Heart Attack? Why not the first album? Why not go through chronologically? Something really draws me to News of the World, and I'm trying to figure that out with this recording here. Inevitably, what one has to do is sit down with the album and just actively listen to it and think about it. Why is this appealing to me? Is this all in my head? Of course, it will be all in my head, but why does my head like it so much? Because I used to have a bias against this album. We Will Rock You and We Are the Champions are the most cliche and potentially overplayed songs in the history of rock music. I don't know if there's going to be much dispute over that. That's not commenting on the quality of the songs, my opinion on those songs personally, at least for now, although their status as being potentially overplayed is what it is, right? And it would be potentially easy to dismiss some of the rest of the album as tracks one does not recognize. And maybe if there was one, we'll get to this later, but if there's one in particular that doesn't tickle one's fancy, they might end up with a poor taste in their mouth, in their ears, when the rest of the album plays out. By the time side B is finished, you are kind of potentially dismissive of this as just another Queen album, although I would take some slight disagreement with this potential hypothetical dismissal. Queen's most critically acclaimed album is A Night at the Opera. It's a great album, but in my opinion, it's no Led Zeppelin 4, it's no Who's Next, it's no The Dark Side of the Moon, it's no Paranoid Black Sabbath. It's still pretty great, but I think it just goes to show where Queen was sitting at with the quality of their albums in comparison to other groups. I will say, it wasn't uncommon to see Queen songs listed as some of the best of all time, Bohemian Rhapsody most famously or infamously, right up there with Stairway to Heaven or Baba O'Reilly or Won't Get Fooled Again or whatever you want to name, some Fleetwood Mac song, whichever. And I'll say this, I think Queen's best songs are as good as any other rock group's best songs, or some, the very best of them. I really do. I don't necessarily feel the same way about the albums, or sometimes I'm tempted to feel this way about News of the World and A Day at the Races, and also Queen 2 to some extent. But let's focus on News of the World in particular, because sometimes I feel as though that this is my favourite Queen album, and potentially one of my absolute favourite albums of all time at this point, and I find that kind of baffling. I'm trying to figure that out with this recording here, as I stated before. I was always wary of this album because of its extraordinarily brilliant, striking, unforgettable cover art. I always felt a certain degree of maybe mock anxiety, but trivial anxiety at an album cover that was as strong as one like that. Any really amazing album cover, I think, this is going to make me biased toward the music on the album. And so I go in skeptical, and I am more ready to dismiss the album, especially if it's not considered a classic album. I used to get concerned that I would overrate music based upon how much I liked an album cover. The album art is phenomenal. There's no doubt about it. There's no denying that, obviously. It's some of the very best ever. Probably Queen's best, I would say. I mean, I don't know what else one could suggest is. As one might know, artist Frank Kelly Freyas had illustrated a drawing for the cover of the October 1953 issue of Astounding Science Fiction, featuring a robot holding up a dead human, imploring its father to fix it. Roger Taylor apparently had this magazine as a boy, and they decided to contact the original artist, Freyas, and ask him to recreate it for their album cover. And the rest is history. So when I went in to listen to this album for this now fresh assessment, I decided I'm going to go in with it only judging it by the music, imagining how I'd feel about this music if there was no album art. And I find my appreciation for the album to be as precise as ever before, and the album art, the glorious album art, was just a bonus. And somewhat integral to this album as a cultural moment rather than just as a sola scriptura piece of music. And both factor into one's appreciation, at least my appreciation of an album in the grand scheme of things. Ultimately, the music itself is more important, but the cultural memory, the kind of what reverberates about one, and imagining everyone else, other humans, other people listening to this music, getting an idea of a lineage through time by the experience of the recorded music. Assessing a piece of recorded music as a cultural statement is almost as pivotal to me as the music itself. And I think a lot of other people feel that way too, whether they realize it or not. Some people certainly would very much go out of their way to try and separate cultural implications with, you know, an attempt at an objective analysis of a piece of music. Although I happen to think that assessing the potential cultural associations with a piece of music, with a piece of recorded music, is a fascinating way of dissecting it, and either potentially magnifying or even raising doubt upon their potentially or claimed classic status. I would suggest anyway. What do I mean by cultural statement? What this album means in the communicative ether. Now, what does that mean, even? It means what it means to wear a shirt of the album art. What that communicates, what that statement is. That is what I'm talking about when I talk about the cultural associations, the cultural statement associated with a piece of recorded music, and in this case, the album, what Eric Davis might refer to as the commodity supreme. So without further ado, there's been plenty of it, let's get in through the track list of this album. Let's try and describe my experience listening to it. We Will Rock You. It's one of the first rock songs or popular songs I got into. I was in year one. I was 6 or 7 years old. My history with Queen goes as such. It begins with that We Will Rock You anecdote, and We Are the Champions I heard. It was via a friend at school, actually. And then my parents finding out I was into both of those songs naturally popped the Queen Greatest Hits CD in the car, and I got into all these other songs as well. Queen were the first rock band I was really familiar with the music of. Afterwards, Mum put in the Beatles one CD, and well, I learnt them. But when I first heard We Will Rock You, I thought it was brutal. It was, blood on your face, you big disgrace. It was the song's lyrics were just insulting people. It was so cool and rad and just wicked. Now it's a stadium sport cliche, almost a cringe. You kind of imagine it in the context of like rugby league games or that film A Knight's Tale or a garbage musical, Ben Elton. Ugh. Frankly, it hurts Queen's cred rep. The presence, the popularity, the reputation of that song, We Will Rock You. Looking at it objectively, I think it's a fine track. It's fine. It's pretty good. And if you heard it for the first time, you'd think it was a pretty catchy song, not the greatest thing you'd ever heard. I suppose it has an impact when you've never heard a kind of a brutal rock song before, or any more rock songs more brutal than it, certainly, when one is like 6 or 7. But hey, when one's in their 20s and heard the song maybe over 100 times, and even without factoring that in, if I'd heard all the music I'd heard, and then I heard We Will Rock You for the first time now, yeah, I'd think, oh yeah, it's a pretty fine song. It's cool. It's pretty catchy. But yeah, it is what it is, right? And you know what? That's a fun Brian May guitar solo. It must be said, Brian May was a great guitarist, but I don't think anyone will disagree with that. I'm not much of a guitarist kind of guy, but Brian May excites me. I think he's pretty cool. I mean, the band in general, Freddie Mercury's quite a great vocalist. No, we all know that. I didn't even need to state that. John Deacon's a very, very able bass guitarist. Roger Taylor's a fun drummer. Not quite John Bonham or Keith Moon, Ginger Baker, Carl Palmer, whoever you want to name, but I think he's good and solid for what he is. I think the music he contributes to the band can be quite fun and idiosyncratic and different. It gives a bit of bounce and oddness to an album's track list, for better or for worse, in In some cases, maybe. But then I consider a real classic to be We Are the Champions. This is another song I've heard probably over 200 times in my life. For whatever reason, this song was on repeat in the car. Somebody to Love as well. And We Are the Champions, it's like, it's burned into my brain. And even if I hadn't experienced it in the car so many times, it's just been in popular culture everywhere. But you know what? I actually do think this is a really strong song, especially in the context of pretend you have never heard it before. It's really, really good. The piano chords in this song are beautiful and simple, and the backing vocals are gorgeous. It's a very fine production to my ears. And what a classic rock iconic 1-2 punch the first two tracks on this album are. It's hard to believe that an album exists where the first two tracks, We Rock You, We Are the Champions. Isn't this going to be one of the most sought after and beloved hard rock albums of all time? Well, no and yes, apparently. The rest of the tracks don't have quite the same reputation, but perhaps they ought to. Let's go through these. Well, not just now. Allow me to make this point just quickly first. Oh, hopefully a bit quickly. Queen are a truly transatlantic band. They were a British group, they were inescapably British, and yet they became kind of an American institution. They were truly transatlantic, knew it, and embraced their American audience while they felt they remained distinctly, inescapably British. And in the UK, they were always a British band, so there was always this... Yeah, Queen, one of the truly international, or at least transatlantic rock groups in the English-speaking world. The next track is Sheer Heart Attack. It's exemplary. Anyone who has any doubts about Queen, listen to this track and enjoy yourself. That's all I have to say. I'm even glad it didn't show up on the classic album Sheer Heart Attack, just so it could be a banger here. I guess it's a bit of a House of the Holy being on Physical Graffiti a little bit situation. I don't know, but sure, to be honest. And All Dead is great. Go and listen to this track if you have doubts about Queen. It's one of their most beautiful songs. Truly a moving tune. Very powerful. And so far so good on this album. I'm thinking this is going to be an amazing piece of work if it keeps this up. Unfortunately for a blip, it doesn't. Well, for about 4 minutes. Spread Your Wings. Spread Your Wings is why people dislike Queen. Crappy ballad. I do not care for ballads much. Weakest point in the track list. Most powerful argument against this album. I see a lot of praise online. I read comments describing Spread Your Wings as a great classic song. I really don't like this kind of music. A lot of other people don't as well, and it's these sorts of people who tend to like more edgier, more abrasive rock music, you know, which is what rock music is known to be. And so that's why there is some snobbery against Queen, because of songs like Spread Your Wings. Those who are on board with Queen, they think something like Spread Your Wings is usually fine. I am totally on board with Queen, although I'm not on board with Spread Your Wings. I cannot be. And I have to say now, this song's presence on the album made me dismiss it. Oh, this isn't going to be a great album. Spread Your Wings is on there. But hey, Changes is on Black Sabbath Volume 4. That's a weird case, because that kind of helps that album be as crazy, abrasive, ridiculous, and metal as it is. But just the fact that Changes in the middle of that track list makes it like a completely inane and indescribable trip, I think. And you can say the same thing about things like Obla Di Obla Da or Birthday on White Album, or some of the lesser Sgt. Pepper's tunes. Yeah, Spread Your Wings, not a fan, unfortunately. Forgive me if you enjoy that song, or I really don't care for it, and I kind of wince when it comes on the album, which is unfortunate, because it's one of the longer tracks on the album as well. Oh my goodness. I must say, for all this talk of Queen trying to strip down their sound and go back to basics and more straight up hard rock arena anthems, Spread Your Wings is the kind of thing which the Sex Pistols still would have mocked them for, sounds to me. Fortunately, we have Fight from the Inside. Thumbs up. But then, possibly slightly overshadowed by the next track, Get Down, Make Love. A masterpiece, possibly my favourite cut on the album. Peak 70s driving in the car, Freedom Queen. Those choruses. you feel like a young Hank Hill or something, right? Male empowerment, fantasy, young boomer, the UFO abduction is just the greatest. It's it's a song about him. He wants to get down with his girlfriend wherever he goes. Doesn't care if it's at the party, if it's at the park. While they're doing it at the park, there's a UFO abduction. Make love, make love, make love, make love, make love. But the extraterrestrials demand, for their study, get down, make love. And he's happy to oblige. What a ridiculous and gorgeous 70s rock bombast. Something that Frank Zappa would parody and not change a fucking word of it. Oh my goodness. If you're skeptical about Queen, check out this song. It is the Queen you know, and yet it will sell you on Queen. I'm telling you that. This is a case, dare I say, I appreciate and love this song so much that if it was not on the track list, I'd appreciate the album notably less. I'll say that much. I'd still really like the album, but nevertheless, it's that strong. It's very, very memorable. I like Sleeping on the Sidewalk. Sounds like an example of what Martin Popoff would refer to as Queen's rapport with novelty, and how these bizarre little tracks pop up on their albums, from Bring Back That Leroy Brown on Sheer Heart Attack, I'm in Love with My Car on Night at the Opera. A couple of tracks on A Day at the Races are brilliant tracks, but nevertheless. Or even something like, I don't know if you'd call Crazy Little Thing Called Love Novelty doing a rockabilly track in 1980. I don't know. Who Needs You is quality. Really like that song. I mean, I don't know if it's the kind of song that most people would consider corny, cheesy, or lame, or a bit flamboyant, a bit camp, but I think it's a spectacularly fun and pleasing song, honestly. It's Late. That's pretty classic. You can't go wrong with that. It might be a bit cliche Queen to some detractors, although, hey, I really, really like this tune. And I really like My Melancholy Blues. It's kind of a spoof of a slow piano jazz ballad, bluesy, and Freddie nails it. I think it's it's a delightful song. I'd almost recommend, just go and listen. If you're so inclined, go and listen to it. It's a fantastic number. I can't imagine a better way to close this album. I'll say that. All in all, the variety and art rock pomp and uniqueness makes Queen distinct, memorable, and iconic in the classic album's canon, but also different and criticized or ostracized from it by the Led Zeppelin purists, say. This album beautifully encapsulates what appeals to me about a great Queen album from the 1970s. The variety, the strangeness, the voyage that you're taken upon. There's little else like it in the rock or recorded music album canon in general. Parkland, part art rock, hard rock, straight up pop, music hall. They could do it all. They were so bizarre and so mainstream. When you really, it's so unusual. And when you really dive into the discography, you realize just how strange they were, despite having this accessibility via their most mainstream and commercial hit singles. But yeah, to me, this is the album I listen to and I want to imagine myself as a 1970s suburban teenager. It'd be in the latter part of the decade, of course, 77 on, and you'd be sitting upstairs in your room, just listening to this, wanting to spread your wings and fly away, looking at this album cover for the entirety of the track listing, flipping it over to side B, doing the same thing. Few albums take me there as vividly, as viscerally, as Queen's News of the World. It's like the songs are written from the perspective of a rock music fan. It's so fascinating, really. This album represents Queen as one of the most popular recording artists in the history of music, but also as a group of incredibly creative, unbelievably imaginative deep cuts, and these magnificent and bewildering album tracks found throughout those who want to reward themselves if a listen to a piece like News of the World, for instance. Rock band that really tried to put effort into the albums, much as Led Zeppelin and The Who and the Beatles, David Bowie had, and yet has not really gotten the credit for it in the same manner, for one reason or another, by either the mainstream or from the snobbier music critics. Both. And yet, News of the World is one of the most encapsulative moments of 1970s rock music idealism that I've ever heard. It is unbelievable. It feels like such an empowering testament to that era and the kind of fantastical idealism of that era, the kind of rock music empowerment fantasies. Getting out of the suburbs and going on a quest to get the girl and to go and prove the world that you're worth something, you know. It's just such a fantastic and identifiable vision, but such a poignant, fun, and optimistic moment in time, despite the, I guess, the 1970s being such a turbulent time politically, and yet there were these kind of little protected, I guess, somewhat privileged havens in the suburbs where they'd have these dreams and ideals about what else could be, and I think I find it incredibly moving, to be frank. The music as is, it's rock music, plain and simple. I know some people who have a genuine, sincere, earnest distaste for Queen's music, and it just is what it is, and they don't claim it to be an objective thing, they just claim it to be just an idiosyncrasy, more or less. And to those, I can understand and respect they're not being able to get into this album, but I must say, I find it one of the most rewarding experiences in the history of rock albums. Queen, the 1970s, rock music, idealism, power, imagination, personal glory, confidence.